Joe Rogan, is he now another useful idiot for the Kremlin? So Joe Rogan is the world's biggest podcaster. I watch many of his episodes from many years back. I don't watch him so frequently in the last few years, and he caused a huge controversy in the last 2 weeks with his behavior with respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war. He shouted basically at the Ukrainians to go F themselves on his podcast because they were going to cause World War III. You people, Ukrainian President Zelensky, and then he demanded you take a drugs test. So what is going on? Why is Joe Rogan repeating these very clear pro-Kremlin talking points that Joe Biden, by giving permissions to the Ukrainians to use medium-range conventional weapons against Russian military targets within de jure Russia, is going to cause World War III, and Russia is going to respond with nuclear weapons against the United States, UK, and France. I have a video about this topic from about 2 weeks ago. So Joe Rogan had his outburst, and a lot of people were surprised, but ultimately he is part of an echo chamber on the internet that is increasingly going by the mantra, Russia good, Ukraine bad. Tucker Carlson, obviously the most famous, we'll say, internet personality. I wouldn't really call him a journalist anymore, who's now off apparently in Russia interviewing the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and infamously he had an interview with Vladimir Putin almost a year ago where Vladimir Putin bored the hell out of everyone for 45 minutes, rambling on about revisionist Russian history. And you could also take, say, Patrick Bet-David, who also comes into my news feed, also gives a very strongly pro-Kremlin slant on his coverage in terms of the political discourse with the Russo-Ukrainian war. So Joe Rogan, basically with all this hysteria around Russia changing its nuclear doctrine, which is another red line that basically everybody can safely ignore because, well, Russia didn't fire nuclear weapons. Again, as was expected, they actually look more and more toothless in terms of their nuclear deterrent. However, they do push very hard to keep this in the minds of populations in the US or in Western Europe that they're going to nuke everybody if they help the Ukrainians resist Russian aggression. And there isn't very strong support to that because, well, Russia puts all these red lines, and then after a lot of hesitation, the Western allies of Ukraine go past them, and then Russia just rattles its nuclear saber again, and then we go on without a response. The reason, in short, why Russia doesn't use nuclear weapons is it not in its interest to start a nuclear war and basically have themselves destroyed in addition to large parts of the West, apparently. However, the hysteria around it and the fear that that drives is very important for trying to prevent Ukraine's allies from supplying it with military aid, because obviously that military aid is very effective against the Russian military and their war effort in Ukraine. So Joe Rogan, why has he fallen into this? Well, at first I thought, okay, he was just a bit hysterical. He reacted this way because the fear works on people like him. However, you have to also remember the business sphere in which Joe Rogan operates, because he's become increasingly popular over a long period of time. He endorsed Donald Trump, even interviewed Donald Trump before he was elected, and obviously he's going to take power in the US in the second half of January. And because of this increasingly popular mantra of Russia good, Ukraine bad on the American right of the spectrum, him not going along with this would probably hurt his brand. And in fact, afterwards, Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv and a former world champion boxer, he challenged Joe Rogan to come on, to bring him on his podcast, and then he could explain, as someone who's obviously from Ukraine and living there during the war, and obviously pretty relatable because he's also involved in the fight business, just like Joe Rogan is to a certain extent and has been. And Joe Rogan seemed to feign that he didn't know who Klitschko was. Very strange. It's almost like he's scared to bring on someone like Klitschko, who give obviously a very different point of view and perspective on the Russo-Ukrainian war. On top of that, Joe Rogan said in another podcast later on that either Volodymyr Zelensky, or though I would assume it's someone from his office, contacted Joe Rogan Experience about Zelensky himself coming on the podcast, which would make a lot of sense. Obviously, we've had Tucker Carlson interviewing Vladimir Putin, and Joe Rogan interviews major political figures like Donald Trump, so why not Volodymyr Zelensky? Surprisingly, it seemed that, or unsurprisingly, if you understand Joe Rogan's thinking, he wasn't in favor of bringing on Volodymyr Zelensky. So he's basically scared almost to bring on a significant Ukrainian voice or politician to give an alternative perspective, and that's because it would be, in my opinion, off-brand for Joe Rogan to bring on voices that are going to contradict. His audience probably won't like it. You just have to look at the comments underneath, increasing Tucker Carlson's videos, Patrick David's videos, and it seems Joe Rogan, to know that they are in this kind of information space that is heavily influenced by people who are supporting Russia to one extent or another. So very sad to see, and a little bit pathetic from Joe Rogan that he tries to pretend he doesn't know who Vitaly Klitschko is and doesn't want to bring on Zelensky because, why? Because he would be a different perspective. Tucker Carlson, on the other hand, claims that he actually wants to interview Zelensky, but is prevented from doing so. Not sure if that is really true or not. He is a bit cavalier with the truth quite often, Tucker Carlson, and he's over in Russia interviewing the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. However, there is another podcaster who is in the same circle with Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman. He had an exchange on X with Zelensky, and it appears that he is going to interview Zelensky. So at least we have that within that kind of echo chamber, that sphere of podcasters who is going to give the opportunity to the Ukrainian president to speak to an audience that's not as big as Joe Rogan's, but is still pretty significant. Lex Friedman was actually born in the Soviet Union. He tends to have a podcast that is a bit more intellectual than Joe Rogan, and definitely a little bit less conspiracy theory, contrarian, not quite on the same level as Joe Rogan's brand has become, and for which he's been very successful. So that is what I think the real reason for Joe Rogan's outburst. One, he's just in this echo chamber, and number two, it's his branding. It's just become, sadly, this mantra that may change very quickly after Donald Trump becomes president, if there is some sort of issue between Donald Trump and him getting Vladimir Putin to even talk about any sort of ceasefire. It is plausible that they are not going to see each other very favorably when they come in, when Donald Trump is inaugurated, and then maybe this mantra of Russia good, Ukraine bad, it might change, and let's see what happens. So that is this video. I'm going to leave it there. There was a lot of people who are very angry at Joe Rogan for his outburst, and personally I find it ridiculous to be blaming the victim of aggression and not blaming the aggressor. It looks completely stupid to me, and sad to see another significant American political commentator, cultural podcaster fall into the Kremlin echo chamber with respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war.